Yep. Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the title says. I think there's an important synergy between landscape architecture and ecology. They're both holistic or theoretically holistic kind of concepts and disciplines, and they've got a lot of important things to share with each other. Maybe I sort of see examples where maybe not enough ecology has been incorporated into landscape architecture, but anyway, we'll sort of work through that and see where we get to. I've kind of created a slightly little poetic subtitle there about palettes, patterns, placemaking and prospects. Palettes, of course, relates to species and data that you're using, patterns, how they're displayed in the landscape, both through space and time. Placemaking, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the importance of the way our landscape looks and feels, and the historic legibility it has to our identity and sense of place. And of course, prospects are looking into the future. So, well, you know, landscape is everywhere. And we just don't seem to be able to escape. Landscape architects have got their eyes and ears out looking at the world and interpreting the world. And I'd probably sort of argue it needs a little pinch of ecology in there too. And that's probably my key message, that when you're out there in the future creating designs and landscapes, don't forget the ecological information that needs to inform that. This is just an example of something. I was visiting the doctor this morning and I saw the landscaping around the South Medical Centre there, and I noticed that they've got that, what's that leopard plant thing that's now the sort of fashionable species. You can just see a little bit of it on the top left corner there, to the left of the traffic cone. But on the other side, which is the north-facing, very sunny side, there's the Chatham Island forget-me-not. I can't see it very well, but it's that other little shiny plant just there on the right of that top left slide. And, of course, this is a plant that grows in a sort of permanently humid, rainy kind of environment in the Chatham Islands, and putting it on a very sort of starkly sunny, arid kind of site, despite the extra watering that's being given, you know, doesn't kind of generate a strong ecological legibility. And then just down the road at the roundabout there, I've noticed that they've recently replaced some of the native shrubs there with lamandra, which is now another fashionable species that's been imported from Australia. And yes, it looks very nice and neat and tidy and tusky at this stage, but it's not a native species, and it's kind of continually, in my view, sort of undermines the kind of local sense of place. On the other side of the road there, of course, which is where I took the picture of Nada before, there's a, I think, rather nice, pleasantly sort of native-y looking, textured planting around that corner, which, you know, everyone coming into Lincoln observes. Okay. So let's just start off with the palettes and patterns. As I said, the palettes refers to the pool of species that you've got to use in your design. There's about 1,000 in New Zealand that can be adequate, that can be used in different niches and at different stages of planting. And importantly, these are contributing all to the natural ecology of the landscape. They are hosting birds, lizards, insects and fungi, and often uniquely to host-specific kinds of relationships. Against that, of course, there are more native species, but many of them are sort of alpine or occur in places which are not very easily accommodated in a cultural landscape. Against that, we've got something in the order of 30,000 exotic plants introduced into New Zealand. And about a tenth of these are sort of naturalised, that is, they're now kind of wild, they're sort of self-generating. And at least a couple of thousand of these are regarded as weeds. They're invasive species, and more are probably entering that realm as time goes on, as climate changes and so on. And so we have to be very cautious about introducing new species. Of course, some of them from overseas are cultivars and sterile hybrids and so on, but we can never be sure that they'll remain that way. So this is a bit of a shout for our indigenous species as an important consideration in our future landscape design. As well as the species, of course, there's all the different structural and growth form types: trees, shrubs, tussocks, forbs, vines, perching plants. You know all about that. And in terms of patterns, it's important to understand the underlying environmental gradients that exist in the landscape, the place or the zone, and this contributes to the spatial pattern. But there's also a temporal pattern. Vegetation is not static, it's dynamic, it's continually changing, and you really should be accommodating and understanding that. And this goes right back through time to biogeographical scale of time, through to what's going on in plant succession. That is the change from small colonising plants through to eventually forest and the forest environment. The classic ecological plant successions that go on. So these are the temporal patterns, and they operate, both the spatial and the temporal patterns operate at both very small, fine scale, right up to massive scale in both time and space. And then overlying that is the whole sort of both natural and human intervention or natural disasters even, which might be seen as kind of being represented by different levels of stress or disturbance. In other words, stress is kind of harsh conditions that limit plant growth, and disturbance is something that continually planes off the vegetation and maybe sets it back to an earlier stage of succession. Okay, so just let's have a quick look at the biogeography of New Zealand. And remember, I'm talking largely from a New Zealand experiential perspective here, but of course these same principles apply anywhere in the world, and each place has its own history and its own nature. So casting back more than, say, 70, 80, 90 million years ago, New Zealand, as you can see there, was part of a supercontinent in the southern hemisphere. We call it Gondwana now because of the geological connectivity between all of the component parts of Gondwana. There's a geological similarity which shows how they were connected in the past, and in fact the type locality for that is in India, and hence the word Gondwana, which means land of the Gond. So don't say Gondwana land, because that's sort of like doubling up the word land. Anyway, so you can see that New Zealand's there. A little bit later on, sort of over the next sort of 50 million years or so, all of those parts of that supercontinent sort of started splitting apart and moving north from Antarctica. And importantly, New Zealand left and separated from Australia quite early on. And although we're a relatively tiny component of that, we sort of punched above our weight. We've got lots of significant remnants of plants and animals that date back or related to those very early Gondwana plants and animals that existed back eons ago. And so that long isolation and separation had a significant effect on our biota, but also to its vulnerability to the introduction of northern continental species that started around 1,000 years ago when Polynesians first arrived. They brought rats and dogs and a few introduced plants and some of their disturbance, but of course it was nothing compared to the avalanche of imports that happened when Europeans arrived on the scene a couple of hundred years ago and started introducing all those thousands of plants and also, importantly, animals. And here's an important point to make when understanding our biogeography. read these lips, as they say, there were no native land mammals in New Zealand before humans set foot here. There were those that could fly, like bats, and there were marine mammals. But our natural ecosystems were dominated by birds, by fish, by reptiles, and by insects, some of which kind of took over the role of small mammals, like some of our giant insects were performing the function of little mice and so on in the ecosystem. But instead, of course, we've brought in both browsing mammals like sheep, goats, cattle, etc., on the one hand, deer, and also significantly to our native wildlife, alien predators like stoats, ferrets, weasels, cats, dogs, the whole works, even hedgehogs there which love eating large wetters. Okay, so as a consequence we've got lots of extremely threatened rare species, and they're not just like any old species, they're actually very significant. For example, our frogs are some of the most ancient still living in the world that date back to those Gondwanan times. Similarly, our tuatara is sort of a one-only representative from the dinosaur era. And even our humble little rock wren that's sort of got a little niche up in the mountains now is ancestral to the whole songbird clade of birds in the world. It's highly significant, and yet it's very threatened. And we've got the only flightless parrot and various other things. In terms of plants, there was, of course, we've got lots of connections back to Gondwana. Our big kauri tree in the far north has relatives still in South America and around the Pacific and so on. The araucarians, the monkey puzzle trees and so on. Also the beech, our beech trees have relations with the beech in Australia and South America and also Africa. And there's other sort of smaller things which have probably arrived through long distance dispersal from as New Zealand's level in the sea kind of rose and fall in relation to sea level. So at times we've almost been reduced to a small archipelago, and other times, we've had mountain building period in the last 5 million years, which has pushed us up into the alpine zone. Right. And among the flora that we've got now, it's quite different, even though it might be related to other species around the world, and particularly in northern temperate environments. Ours are sort of a bit peculiar, like many of our plants which are notably herbaceous in the northern hemisphere, like clover, legumes, peas and beans and so on. Just about all of ours are woody, like the kowhai there on the bottom right. Similarly, lilies are generally regarded as herbaceous, but we have a lot of woody lilies, like the cabbage tree, for example. And even one of our common canopy and understory shrubs and trees, members of the Melicitus genus, are in the violet family. And importantly, our native flora, of course, is adapted to that bird-driven ecosystem, which and the bush birds often need nectar or berries to eat rather than dry fruits like acorns or pine cones, seeds. And so they get like the tui, the honey-eating birds, they get their nectar from the New Zealand flax or harakeke, and also from the kowhai tree. But then they also feed on the berries of our giant noble trees, the totara, matai, kahikatea, and so on. That's the podocarp family, which is one of those southern Gondwanic families, and also from many of our other trees and shrubs. About 75% of our woody plants produce berries and or nectar, unlike only about a quarter of our introduced trees and shrubs. Right. Well, we can use all of this information in various ways, and I'm not going to pretend to be more of an artist than all of you, but I often play with these ideas myself and think, how do we represent these ancient times, with sculptures, with the fact that we've got some ancient cabbage trees in our school, Burnside High School, for example, near the airport, which is regarded as being a trail marker from early Māori trails through the Canterbury Plains. And, of course, up on Banks Peninsula, you can still see the bottom right there, some logs of the ancient podocarp trees that once dominated the peninsula as little as 100 years ago or so. Okay, so that's a bit of biogeography there. Quickly looking at some of the broader patterns of the environment which we need to respond to. New Zealand has a very wide range of bioclimatic zones, from sort of subtropical in the far north to subantarctic in the far south, and as we'll see shortly, that can be represented here, sort of in cross section, with the sort of warm temperate environment to the right and to the far north, and sort of grading up into alpine and permanent snow and ice, although that's diminishing, up on the top. And if you take that zonation all the way south, you come to the subantarctic islands, where tree line, one of those important bioclimatic thresholds, is right down at sea level. And above that, you've got all these wonderful flowering herb fields, which unfortunately don't grow very well on a New Zealand mainland situation. It's just not humid or wet enough to support these large fleshy leaf things and also the lovely flower colours there. Most of our native floras are not quite so spectacular. And that relates back to my second slide, I think, which points out the importance of fitting species appropriately into even-built landscapes, like that Chatham Island forget-me-not. Okay, so there's also a cross-sectional gradient across the South Island here, largely determined by the high mountains of the Southern Alps, where you've got wet air coming from the Indian Ocean and Tasman Sea, up over the mountains, drops all its water on the west side, and then blows hot and dry down the east side, so the rainfall changes from several thousand millimetres on the west to create rainforest through to what we have about 700 millimetres here in Christchurch, which is of a dry forest environment, occasionally punctuated with wetlands, which are kind of topographic features. You know these sorts of pictures that you create to show the range of landforms and landscapes and the soils that are associated with them and the hydrology. You're well familiar with using those kinds of diagrams. Because most of us live in cities, and now most of the world's people live in cities, and about 85% in New Zealand, cities are really important cultural and ecological keys to biodiversity futures. So that's why these messages, I think, are extremely important, and that's where a lot of landscape architecture occurs. It's also the place where, because of the population and the interest in nature increasing, we have the opportunity to rescue some of our lost plants and animals and provide niches and spaces to ensure that our biodiversity survives into the future. And in case you think, well, this is a kind of a bit of an idea that isn't widely popular, there's statistics which show that, in fact, even in Christchurch here, much more than half of our population have indicated they want more native plants in their neighbourhood, and about 3/4 of people want more native birds in their neighbourhood, and many people are actually actively involved in the restoration and trapping of predators to improve our wildlife and so on. Okay, so now let's have a look at some of the elements of the landscape. You'll be familiar with these, I'm sure. So at the large scale, we've got the whole catchment or watershed, and then within that we have blocks of habitat of taller or easily well-defined habitat, which might be forest or it could be wetland as well. And these provide the sort of patchiness of the landscape. When you've got these patches well protected against predation, for example, or against other kinds of disturbance, then you've got a sanctuary situation. And New Zealand's got a particular need for these to preserve our wildlife that have zero tolerance of introduced predators. And so we have to take special note of the need for completely fenced off areas which don't allow any exotic predators in, including cats and dogs. These sanctuaries and patches can be connected by linear patches or corridors, but these have very high edge effect. And then between those, you've got sort of a melange of low-growing vegetation and all sorts of human activity in a cultural landscape, which we can call the matrix, which is between the patches and corridors. I've called it the grime level. You might wonder what I'm talking about there. I'll come back to that later. Of course, there's lots of writers now about landscape architecture who've developed all sorts of metrics around landscape pattern. Okay, so who's Grime? Grime was a fellow, Philip Grime, was an ecologist in Sheffield in England, and he came up with this CSR theory of plant strategy. So CSR, you see down the bottom, there's competitors, stress tolerators, and ruderals. So these were sort of different plant strategies for that were relevant to this survival and development of vegetation, particularly in cultural landscapes, urban and rural environments. And it's basically summed up by that diagram there, in which you've got stress up the y-axis and disturbance along the x-axis there. And disturbance are things like grazing, fire, floods, slips, mowing, gardening, and the maximum disturbance on the far right there shows examples of vegetation that is affected by continual disturbance, like pastures and lawns, which are mown or grazed, or lake shores, which have fluctuating water tables and so on. And high stress is represented by cold, dry, salinity, acid, bogs, for example, infertile sites and or toxic environments, particularly in artificial situations. And so when you have very low stress and low disturbance down in the bottom left corner of that diagram, you have forest, a potential forest environment, and you have very high level of competition between the species. On the other hand, when you have either very high disturbance or very high stress, there's no competition because plants are so sparsely distributed that they don't really interact with each other, and you can have essentially a desert kind of environment. A lot of our cultural landscapes represent that kind of block in between those two extremes, and that's an important consideration. Sorry? Ruderal. Oh, ruderal means a colonising plant that establishes in very disturbed or bare ground sort of situations. Thank you. I think competitor and stress tolerator are fairly self-explanatory, but ruderal isn't. It's kind of an English word, I suppose. It's those little kind of grassy things, or little mossy things, which establish on bare ground, in the pavement and the out there in the quadrangle, or maybe on walls, but in nature, in riverbeds and places like that. Okay, so here's some examples of stressed environments in which we've got, amazingly, plants growing in them. So you couldn't imagine a much more stressed environment than a wall, a rock wall. It's not so stressed up there in Auckland as this picture is taken in, because they have fairly regular rainfall, and so water is sort of descending from the sky relatively frequently. But there's virtually no soil there to hold and maintain water, to maintain plant growth all the time. And so certain kinds of plants will that can occupy those sites have to kind of hunker down during periods of drought, which they're having now, of course, and probably some of these things are shrinking a little bit as a result. But then when the rains come, then they can sort of start growing a little bit and they gradually creep over the wall. So there's some native ferns and orchids and grasses and mosses and things growing in that sort of situation. Another kind of artificial kind of stress environment in an urban situation are rock gardens. And you can see one here was in a Ellerslie Flower Show exhibit a few years ago, 2012. And you can see it's been constructed out of rocks, but also very coarse substrate in between the rocks. Coarse gravel, maybe sand. And so, again, it doesn't have a high water holding capacity and allows some of these small herbaceous plants, and in this case some very rare local native plants, which otherwise have been lost from the wider landscape as a result of development and industrialised farming, etc. And so these can provide important little nodes of habitat for some of our rare species. Green roofs, which is a bit fashionable these days, can also provide important stressed habitats for those stress tolerator species, because you've only got a very sort of shallow soil which can't hold much moisture, and so they have to be very drought tolerant kind of species to survive in these situations. Interestingly, it's a bit hard to see, but there's actually some native orchids that have self-colonised a green roof down in Geraldine, actually. Right, and we've also used this relatively recently in a constructed environment along the southern motorway, where on the north-facing, sunny, dry slope, we got the engineers to incorporate a bed of very coarse substrate. You can see the coarse shingle there. And we incorporated some of the dry grassland species that were being lost either through the motorway development itself or have been gradually fragmented and lost across the wider Canterbury Plains. And so there's geraniums and muehlenbeckias and little daisies and grasses and what have you. And you can contrast those pictures on the bottom left there with just down the slope from that special substrate created, where the normal kind of overlay of topsoil has been put onto the shoulder of the motorway, and you've got tall shrubs and grasses and things growing, and a very competitive situation which basically excludes these other little rare herbaceous things. Okay, so that's stress. Let's have a look at disturbance. I always love this picture. It's from a pond in South Christchurch, and interestingly, it's the ultimate kind of disturber. It's there swimming around the pond and then plucking the vegetation as far as it can reach with its long neck, and creating a zone of very continually disturbed, if you might say, mown grassland. And you can see the difference between, it's quite a sharp line there about where the yellow circle is. On the left you've got very short turfy vegetation, and to the right you've got a more sort of grassy type environment. And amongst all of those species close to the pond, there's a whole range of little native herbaceous plants, quite rare now in Christchurch and Canterbury, including the little buttercup there. Whereas when you get more competition from the grass to the right, those plants disappear. So grazing marshes, which is again is a European concept, can be a useful tool, management tool, for maintaining rich, diverse native plant communities. And here's another case in a suburban lawn, where you've got this little dichondra growing, the little kidney-shaped leaf there, and also leptonellas on the bottom left there, and a little mazus snapdragon family. So there's a whole range of native herbaceous plants that can grow in these continually disturbed or mown environments. And you might be surprised to know that here, perhaps the most manicured kind of lawn you could imagine, on a bowling green, a weed bowling green, about 99% of the species in that are native herbaceous plants, or leptonellas, colobanthus, plantains, etc., etc. So gardening and mowing is ecologically a form of disturbance. Okay, so when we've had a lot of disturbance, of course, generally in urban environments, but with the earthquakes 10 years ago in Christchurch, there was a lot of kind of rubble created, as has happened in past times associated with war zones. During the Second World War, there's a huge amount of bare ground and rubble created, which essentially was sort of creating kind of rock gardens, if you like. And so you had all these ruderal species, if I can use that word there again, colonising this bare ground and little cracks in the paving, including some quite locally rare species like this grass here, little windgrass, which loved this new open environment. And I'm just looking at what the time is. How are we going? Oh yeah, we're okay. And there's also a fern, native bracken fern, growing up the wall there, and I've seen other ferns growing under sort of dripping downpipes on walls. The majority of the species here are exotic, because we have many introduced ruderal colonising weedy plants. I should have said that another word for ruderal plants is often weeds. I mean, this is a kind of human construct, but the two things are sort of have a common meaning. But there's some native daisies and things there. So the majority of the species there are exotic, but still there are some native and some quite rare native species that are coexisting with this. These are sometimes called recombinant ecosystems. Okay, so now going to sort of have a look now at the kind of theoretical framework that I've talked about, this patch sort of configuration. So looking at this big picture, we've got these patches which can be stepping stones or sanctuaries connected by corridors with the matrix in between, and there's kind of a halo effect that spreads out from those patches, both in terms of sort of wildlife and seed rain kind of spreading out from those protected areas, but also there's a sociological halo in terms of the interaction that wildlife has with the people out in the matrix. First of all, just looking at the ecology of patches, it's important to understand the distinction between long linear patches, like in corridors, for example, where there's kind of an edge effect, which has been measured in New Zealand up to sort of 50 metres. In other words, if you have a forest area, the edge environment, whether it's lesser humidity or wind effect or disturbance from activities going on outside, can spread up to 50 metres into the interior of that patch. And so if you've got a long linear patch like the one at the top, 50 metres either side, 100-metre wide thing, there's actually no core area. It's all edge. And so this affects the range of species that can be accommodated. On the other hand, if you've got a similar area, as shown in the bottom right there, which is kind of isodiametrical or sort of square in shape, compact in shape, the core area within that 50-metre edge is quite substantial, 2¼ hectares in that particular example. Okay, so bearing that in mind, the importance of having large compact shaped patches. And I won't go into the detailed kind of empirical data behind this, but let's say that our kind of conclusion is that if we have a patch arrangement like this through our cultural landscapes, that's urban and rural environments, with large patches every 5 kilometres or so, smaller 1 hectare patches every kilometre, and small groves every neighbourhood or every street or whatever, then you've got a landscape which has ecological integrity or functionality, and or and it also, importantly, because of people living in that matrix in between, it has natural character, because people are surrounded by nature and their native nature, pretty much all the time, and they can very easily access, an experience of forest bathing into those bigger patches, in a short walk or a short bicycle ride from their home. And so that's an important kind of aspect of this halo that I was referring to before. And those patches, can be connected by corridors, and it improves the connectivity. So there's connectivity all around. Okay, so we know what big forest patches look like. Of course, we have a lovely one in Riccarton Bush, Putoringamotu, which is a floodplain forest. There are relatively few now native dryland forests across the Canterbury Plains, but I put that in partly because, of course, one of your great predecessors here in the department is Di Lucas, and still actively having a big effect on the landscape world these days. She's there in one of these dryland patches on Rakaia Island, I think it was. Okay, so those are bigger patches, but, in an urban situation where you've got much more constrained space, there's opportunity for having, really quite small patches, which nevertheless can be like the inner core of a larger patch. For example, this is a courtyard just out the office window where I previously had an office, just down the road at my institute at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. And it's a bit like sort of being in an office and forest bathing, all the time, Shinrin-yoku, that concept. Very valuable for our health. And we can also have micro patches within an urban sort of built context. In this case, a roof garden. This happens to be on the roof of the Department of Conservation building in Wellington, actually. You've got some native plants, you've got some insects that feed on them, there could be lizards there. They're somewhat, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Can't think of it, never mind. It's probably pushing the boundaries a little bit to think there could be rock wrens up there. But nevertheless, there's an opportunity to create a predator-free environment, right in the heart of our high-rise buildings. And why wouldn't we? There are also water patches, of course, within the landscape, and these often provide important ecosystem services, stormwater filtration, attenuation of floods, etc., etc. And all of these, contribute to the legibility of our landscapes. This just shows how, in fact, despite how built up our cities might appear, they nevertheless contain quite a lot of green space, and this is just a picture which shows the actual or potential habitats that fit that larger ideal optimised model for Christchurch City. And there's kind of examples of existing habitat, of regenerating habitat under, say, exotic canopies like willows or under pines. And there's also planned restoration projects going on, and the numbers in the square brackets are the kilometres, the distance between those patches, and if you don't need to look at the detail, but you can see that a lot of them fit within that kind of idealised model that we were talking about before, and there's opportunity for smaller patches in between. I mentioned that just having forest habitat itself is not enough to protect our particular wildlife because of that problem of they're not being adapted to introduced predators, and so we need some of them to be sanctuaries that are fenced off from those predators and can be a sanctuary to those very sensitive wildlife. And there's a number of examples around New Zealand. New Zealand's kind of one of the places in the world where these ideas have been developed, Zealandia and Wellington. And of course, in the moment, I'm trying to get this one developed in Christchurch as well. Okay, so that's the patches. Let's have a look at corridors. We've got a few good examples of native plant corridors connecting those patches down Queen Elizabeth II Drive in north-east of the city. Quite a mixed range of species. We've rather been sort of limited, I think, by very conventional ideas of what a street tree should be, and it fits very much the kind of European model. But actually, we need to kind of relax a little bit and allow things to look a little bit more wild and a bit like my hair, I suppose. Not quite so neat and tidy and linear and erect, but offer a greater range of species, and importantly, those little tiny stepping stones with fruits in them for our native birds. And you can see a list of species up there. By the way, this information will be available online later. And of course, on a smaller scale, you've got hedges, and there's an interesting case here where a lot of our traditional hedges across the Canterbury Plains were introduced, thorny shrubs like gorse and so on, blackberry perhaps. And here's an example, not far from here, in which that's been gradually replaced through sort of management by a native vine called Muehlenbeckia complexa, and importantly it provides a wildlife habitat and food sources for native butterflies and birds. Anyway, lots of native species can be incorporated in these sorts of environments. The other kind of main kind of corridor is waterways, and there's a whole sequence of species going from the water's edge through Kahikatea on the floodplain and Pukaka, cabbage trees and so on, through to the slightly higher scarp environment and Totara on the top there. So those are the local podocarp species, those big giant southern conifers I've been referring to. And waterways and wetlands, other on a smaller scale. Importantly, water races or courses through the Canterbury Plains are often the only place where we've got natural wetland or riparian vegetation and associated wildlife left on the Canterbury Plains. Ironic as that seems, even though they're artificial structures, they've accumulated the species that have been lost from the natural wetlands as they've been developed for farmland. Okay, where's Simon? I couldn't go through this without involving Simon and his artwork, just harking back to a whole kind of landscape concept here, showing a kind of conventional rural landscape dominated, as it's intended to show here, with exotic species compared to one which has got a much greater diversity and species richness, and particularly of indigenous species with connectivity and so on. And there are examples around the countryside, not so many, this is in the North Island, where you've got natural patches of native forests and sometimes hedgerows, as I've shown before, of native species. And here's another similar situation in the high country, again sort of a conventional type agricultural landscape as we've got now. Of course, now it's got big circular irrigators over the top of it, with maybe little kind of protected areas sort of out of sight and out of mind, as opposed to one in which those native species are right up in front in the visible range of people travelling and passing through that landscape, so that they do get that sense of local flavour and identity with the natural environment. I'm going to sort of push through this pretty quickly now. You can join all of this stuff together, of course, with walkways and trails and using the underlying hydrological and soil patterns to inform your species palette. Okay, so this might be a bit controversial. To me, this is an example of where we've sort of maybe let exotica, outside influences affect our own landscape. And I mentioned the Anzac Drive in eastern Christchurch, where you've got Australian gum trees dominating the vegetation. Even though there's some native trees behind, it's almost like we're sort of have an inferiority complex about our own species. And I'd probably argue also, I know Jack and others had some involvement with the memorial wall. I know there was original plan to have cherry blossoms and they went to maples because of the water table situation. I would have liked to have seen maybe some thought given to incorporating something that had both an Asian flavour and a New Zealand flavour. There's the Buddha pine, for example, which is related to our totara, which penetrates up into Eastern Asia, and maybe that might have been a connectivity from a biogeographic point of view to the sad loss of people both from Asia and from New Zealand that occurred during the earthquake period. Anyway, moving along. So just finally, I'm going to sort of show a few sort of final inspirations, if you like, from this overall talk, celebrating unique natural and cultural heritage that's legible to citizens and visitors, looking forward with history accumulating, and it's hard to go past the last week or so without reference to the whole issue of cultural, religious tensions and how we can make a more inclusive world. It's important not to be silent about these things, to make sure that we keep giving out positive, creative messages, inclusive messages. Because in many cases your landscape art may endure for centuries, and so we'll continue to propagate messages like, the pebble in the pond rippling out for a very, very long time. So, I see that our duty is to ensure it's authentic, kind to people and the earth. And so just some last images, which I won't dwell on too much, time running out. You've seen some of these things incorporating the indigenous culture, sculpture, art. This is the Elizabeth Flower Show exhibit, which incorporated, I called it a combo, the Canterbury Nature Combo. Sort of a pocket park which had lawns and bush and waterways, treatment trains, etc., all kind of within the space of about 100 square metres. Green roofs, living walls, swales, and this was outside here actually, pervious paths and so on. And I think some of you have recently been to the Taitapu Sculpture Garden and seen this amazing kind of interweaving of art, sculpture, meaning, and in a native plant setting. And some from the Botanic Gardens. Something that I particularly love about the Canterbury natural environment are these sort of textured type environments. This is down at Ladbrokes, not far from here, incorporating actually a burnt out macrocarpa tree, the very sort of iconic form of the cabbage tree, divaricating shrubs, small leaf shrubs, which are a convergent kind of evolution for the kind of dry plains environment that we have here. Also the unusual juvenile forms of some of our trees, like the lancewood here, forming sort of plant signatures, giving some sort of character to the place. Incorporating, I'm a bit of a fan of Joan Nassau, who you're probably well aware of, who generated the idea of messy ecosystems and tidy frames. In other words, accommodating the desire for people to have control and tidiness and order, but at the same time having recombinant systems which not only provide certain ecosystem services like deciduous European trees here, but incorporating the colour of the winter kowhai here, which is feeding our native honey-eating wildlife. And in sharp contrast, in a way, or complementary to the Taitapu Sculpture Garden I just referred to, is this, I've only just recently discovered this, the Giant's House in Akaroa, which actually doesn't use native plants at all, but incorporates some really interesting art kind of connectivity between architectural plants and amazing artwork using probably 1 million pieces of ceramic pottery to create those incredible landscape there. Well, as I've sort of implied, our plants also give rise to our cultural messages. The koru, for example, a symbol of new life and so on, used in our New Zealand national airline. Even the sort of humble bracken fern that grows along our railway lines can be a window into ancient fires that determine the shape of our landscape. Incorporating right in the heart of the city the idea of a bush city environment like they've got up on the Wellington waterfront, and I've used Tennille's image here as well, showing what that might look like, incorporating all the sort of natural habitats of Canterbury, and so on. I think 2 more pictures. One is understanding the effect of history and not planing it all away. As I often sort of point out, if the ancient Greeks and Romans had bulldozers, there'd be no ruins there now for people to line up and view. People are fascinated by these things. I would have had a different view as to what might have happened to the cathedral here. But on perhaps a slightly sort of sombre note, but an uplifting one, I kind of had this idea that, and we keep hearing this message from people that were affected by the terrible events this time last year, of how we very quickly forget. And we need some sort of symbol, not one that's going to cost zillions of dollars, which I don't think the world can afford now. We need simple symbols which are enduring and which somehow embrace all of humanity and all of nature and join those things together in sort of pathways and sightlines of enlightenment. And I call it sort of a landscape of love, life and light. I won't sort of dwell on this anymore because I think we've used up the time. So thank you for listening. Happy to receive any sort of comments or thoughts.
Thank you, Colin. Any questions, discussion topics, comments?
Colin, could you make a comment about how the design phase extends out in the future? Because one of the big challenges of public transcripts is the makings of it. Yes. Now, subtle understanding that leads to a design will be lost for management. Doesn't hear that. But could you just comment possibly implications of these ideas for management and maintenance? What are some of the skills and values that need to be viewed in the management and maintenance process?
I think your part of your point is the enduring of these designs, and of course, as I said, the kind of ripple effect that will spread out indefinitely. So it's very important to have a sense of the future and accumulated history. In terms of the sustainability of the design, I think is your key question here. This is where the understanding of the ecology of the environment and of the species that you're dealing with, and utilising that Philip Grime framework, stress disturbance framework, as a means of understanding and managing those species. And I think it's a very useful framework for producing more sort of sustainable types of designs. And one of the things which I know there's huge pressure on you and designers to provide the perfect low plant that grows knee high and stays like that forever in a forest environment. Well, it doesn't work. But you, of course, can create a very stressed environment in which the vegetation will stay stunted, or you have to undergo continual maintenance. In other words, you've got to either provide stress or disturbance in order to maintain short vegetation in a forest environment. So understanding all the individual species and their ecology is critical to that. Okay.
Any other comments? Well, thank you very much, Colin.